content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, sensitive topics, and explicit language that may be triggering, offensive, or sensitive subjects to some viewers and listeners. Discretion is advised. The purpose of this podcast is to explore and discuss true crime cases for entertainment and educational purposes only. This podcast does not intend to glorify or sensationalize crime, but rather aims to analyze and understand the complexities of human behavior in the criminal justice system. We encourage listeners to approach this content with empathy, critical thinking, respect for the victims and their families.
Picture this. A man walks into a sheriff's office in California. He's quite uneasy. He unzips his jacket and pulls out a severed body part, a woman's breast, placing it on the counter. As the officers stood there in shock, he leans over and says, "I think I need to talk to someone." That man was Wayne Adam Ford, a long-haul truck driver with a dark secret. For over a year, he had traveled highways of California, picking up women and leaving trails of horror in his wake. But unlike most serial killers, Ford didn't wait to be caught. He turned himself in. The question is why? Tonight, we're going to dive into the mind of a killer who lived the life on the road and ended it behind bars. Who was Wayne Adam Ford? What drove him to confess? And how did it take 25 years to identify his first victim? So let's unravel this mystery together. It's time to start the show. Let's hit it. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. I am your host, Winnie Schrader. And tonight I was looking up different serial killers and seeing their patterns, what makes them tick. Are there similarities among them that we can use as a marker on identifying these psychotic behaviors? Now, it's rare for them to just come out and say, "I did it," unless they're already like sitting on death row and they just need that attention, so they give false confessions. But this serial killer, Wayne Adam Ford, was an odd duck when it comes to the normal deviance of a serial killer. Whatever that standard may be. But his rituals and his play to confess in the most horrific way that left the entire Humboldt County Sheriff's Department just speechless. Now, best-selling author Caitlin Rother wrote the book Body Parts, A Serial Killer's Deadly Compulsions, to point out why these key moments in Wade Adam Ford's case and seeking justice for those victims. Now, Caitlin Rother is an award-winning journalist and a best-selling author, and she has contributed to publications like the Boston Globe and worked for the San Diego Union Tribune. She's also had over 250 media appearances on shows like 2020, People Magazine Investigates, and so on. So I'd like to welcome Caitlin to the show. Welcome to the show, Caitlin.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so this guy, Wayne Adam Ford, he was convicted of killing 4 women, I believe.
Yes.
But what kind of made him stand out as a serial killer? Because the crux of this story, we really want to talk about the updates on using science and DNA evidence, which I'm really, really excited to talk about. But if we could just get some backstory on his case and what happened to these women that brought him to this conviction.
I'm not a serial killer expert, so I
Uh-huh.
can't talk about him compared to a lot of other serial killers, other than the fact that he did turn himself in, which I think is incredibly rare.
Right.
That's the reason I wrote the book, in fact, because I'd never heard of a serial killer who turned himself in. And Wayne Adam Ford made national news because he turned himself in with a woman's severed breast in a baggie in his jacket pocket at the Eureka Sheriff's Station in Humboldt County. So that was what was so shocking. He said, "I heard some people." And he said the reason he brought this breast with him is so that they would believe him. I guess if he just said, I heard some people and they're like, well, what do you mean? So he's like, well,
Right.
here. And they were like, hey, what are you doing? Because he was reaching into his pocket and they didn't want him to be pulling out a weapon. But so basically, that was obvious that something was wrong when you have a woman's breast in your pocket. So
Yeah, that's
they
not
brought him
normal.
in and they started interviewing him. And he said that he wanted an attorney,
Mm-hmm.
except that he kept talking. And so they didn't let his attorney come in or get him an attorney for quite some time, which ended up becoming an issue in the case. But in the meantime, he gave them enough details so that they realized that this was a Jane case that they had of an unidentified woman, um, that not the breast that was in his pocket, but when he started talking about some of these other women that he'd hurt, one of
Mm-hmm.
them rung a bell with this detective. It was a torso case. So they found a woman's torso in what's called a slough. So he basically would torture and rape and kill these women while he was in his long haul. So he'd pick them up in his truck. They were mostly sex workers, drug
Mm-hmm.
addicts. Some of the sex workers were drug addicts. Some had mental
Yep.
health issues also. So he'd have sex with them, which they signed up for, but not the kind of sex that he proceeded to do with them, which was rough and choking. So he would choke them, cut off their air by, pressing on their carotid artery, and then bring them back with CPR repeatedly. And so this detective, he started describing where he killed them and where he dropped them off. This first victim, um, they only found her torso, and it was local, Eureka, where he turned himself in, and it was like a year earlier. And so they had been trying to solve who this woman was the whole time because all they had was her torso, except then some months later, her arm at a beach at the end of where the river made its way out to the ocean. So they
Mm-hmm.
found two parts of her, and that's
Oh,
what the update is about. Is that 25 years later, they finally, through genetic, and then we can talk about it later. But I'm just letting you know that was the victim that was identified 25 years later through genetic genealogy. Yeah, the first victim, they called her Torso Girl, Jane Doe. They didn't know who she was.
okay.
So the other women were from other counties. So there were four women total, 4 counties. He picked one up in Las Vegas and then dumped her in a northern or central California county. I can't remember which county, because there's all these different counties that I haven't been to before, up
Yeah.
near Bakersfield and other places. Anyway, so basically off the freeway, and then he would dump them in waterways. So like the California Aqueduct, two of
Ugh.
them were in the aqueduct, one of them was in a ditch, and then one of them was in this slough.
Okay, so he's sitting, and of course, obviously, with him being a truck driver, that's making
Yes,
him a very opportunist serial killer,
yes.
because those truck stops are filled with prostitutes because it's an easy score. I mean, truckers are always there. They have to sleep at these truck stops. So, and there has been a lot of cases where that's the the like
And that's where he
center
picked up one of
point.
them, was right near a truck stop.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, having serial killers be that opportunist and just taking advantage of the environment that he's in and finding these women. Now, did any of his victims escape
Yes.
alive?
So
Okay.
when he's talking to these detectives, he's a mess. He's a psychological. His details really confused. He's crying. I watched a booking video, and I actually took a still shot from that booking video for the cover of the very first edition. And he just looks like a mess. I mean, he was actually, when he was younger, he was a handsome guy. He was in the Marines and pretty good looking guy, and you would never think, oh, he's going to be a serial killer. But
Hmm.
he couldn't keep his details straight, and so it was clear that he was a mess. But I forgot your question now. Sorry.
Oh, well, like, was there any of the, because you said that he would like to sit there and kind of like choke them out, or like that erotic asphyxiation.
Right. Okay. So there were 50 that he said that he had this kind of sex with, and
Okay.
only these 4 did not survive. And I don't remember. I don't think he. I can't remember, to be honest. But there was one who did escape, and she reported the rape
Hmm.
to police right away. So, and the reason he said he let her go was because she listened to him, and he was complaining about his ex-wife, that she wouldn't let him see his son, which is really more just victimization in his own mind. It wasn't really the
Right.
case that it was more like he just didn't make that much of an effort to see his son. But yeah, they broke up, and it was a not a he lived in another state, so he didn't see his son because he wasn't living nearby, and he didn't try that hard. But this sex worker listened to him, and so he said, "Well, I'm going to let you go because you
Hmm.
gave me a shoulder to lean on or whatever." And so he had tied her up and left her at the side of the freeway, and she she was testified at the trial as Sonoma County Doe. And so I interviewed her for the book, and I did use her real name because she gave me permission to do that. Her name was Rachel
Okay.
Holt,
Rachel Holt. Okay.
and she has
Now,
since passed away. So
okay. Now, so she obviously played a huge part in
yeah,
trying
so
to kind
that's
of
how we
piece together.
know what he did to them specifically, because she testified in court what it was like, and it was pretty awful. I mean, it's in the
Yeah.
book, but I don't want to go into details. Pretty bad.
Yeah, yeah, and Rodney Akala, the other serial killer, he kind of did the same thing. He would like to choke them out, then bring them
Mhm.
back
But
and do it
Ford did
again.
stuff in addition to that where he
Hmm.
tortured them and, you know, burned them. I mean, I really don't want to go into it because it's pretty awful. It's worse than what Rodney Alcala did.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, just that mindset of having that God complex, like I can do this to you, I can take your life, I can give it back.
He's very sadistic and masochistic. Sexually, he liked feeling pain too. So, I mean,
Mhm.
ugh.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously, yeah, mentally he was not stable. Now, when it came to the court case, were they trying to do anything like he wasn't competent to stand trial? Were they trying to push for an insanity
No,
plea?
but
Anything like
those
that?
were mitigating circumstances for the death phase of the trial where they decide whether or not to give him, the death penalty. So, when he was there are other things that happened to him. He had a pretty bizarre childhood. His mother was apparently bipolar. And so when he was growing up, he did not have the best role model. She told him that he was the product of rape, that his father raped her in order to produce her. And then she was also very promiscuous. And so they lived on an army base because his dad was US Army intelligence and was
Okay.
traveling a lot. So he'd leave her alone on the base, and she'd be having sex with other, military men. So he grew up with that kind of situation. And then when he was 19, he was in the Marines. He enrolled in the Marines, enlisted, and was taking first aid classes. Now, this is what's ironic: is he was learning about the carotid artery. He's
Mhm.
out on a date with a woman later becomes his wife, and he sees a crash on the side of the road. And he says, "I want to stop and see if I can help." So he gets out,
Okay.
and this passenger is bleeding from the neck. He goes over there, and he's putting pressure on the neck, as he learned to do in first aid classes. And what he
Mhm.
later uses when he's raping these women to cut off their oxygen. But anyway, while he's trying to save this man's life, a drunk driver hit him and knocked him 40 feet down the embankment. And he was in the ICU with a serious brain injury for 9 days. So his brother said that his personality dramatically changed after this
Mhm.
this car crash and this drunk driver hitting him. So, there are apparently a lot of killers who've had serious head injuries. That's actually something common. So he's had,
Mhm.
some of these things are not his fault.
Mhm.
So he's got mental issues. So, and he was also diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, that generally, I was actually married to somebody with this, so I actually know what it's like to live with someone like this.
Oh,
And I did a lot of
geez.
research on it. This is basically caused by, in the first 5 years of your life. So again, based on his relationship with his mother, and his father wasn't around much, and he was apparently very aggressive and very threatening and intimidating. So, I mean, as a child, an environmental thing. It had, nothing to do with his own choices. And then he has this
Right.
head injury. And then, so people say, oh, he's evil. And I say, well, he's sick. He's definitely sick. And I'm not, trying to sympathize or rationalize, but just
Yeah.
explain,
Well,
this guy
it's the
has a
result.
lot going on.
Yeah,
you
and
know,
it's the result of untreated mental illness. I mean,
and
it's
that
just,
too. Yes. He had a whole break military. He had to be restrained, and they gave him Haldol, and he finally calmed down, but he was just acting out. And
yeah.
so and this was after the car crash and the brain
Hmm.
injury. So he's had a lot of things, and then, yeah,
Yeah.
he becomes a long haul trucker, and then he can do these things and nobody knows because he's driving a truck and he's picking these women up and nobody knows.
Now, was his intent, did he say his intention was to kill these
No,
women, or
no, it
is it more
wasn't.
of like an accidental, like he just pressed
He,
on the
yes,
carotid too long and couldn't bring him back?
he claimed these were accidental, which, okay, maybe the first one you might buy that, but by the
Yeah.
second and third, fourth, if you realize that what you're doing causes people to die, then then you should stop doing it. But that's why
Right.
he
You're
turned
doing it
himself
wrong,
in.
dude.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
that's why he turned
Okay.
himself in. He said he knew what he was doing and he was disgusted by it. And he knew he would do it again. And so
Mhm.
I have to give the guy some credit, at least, because I originally wanted to call the killer with a conscience, but
Mhm.
my publisher didn't like that.
Well, we got to take a quick break, but when we come back, let's talk about this update with the DNA identifying one of the victims in 2023 and how that forensic genealogy and DNA testing helped find her. So we'll take a quick break and we'll talk about that right when we get back. Are you feeling lost, stressed, wondering if Mercury is ruining your life again or the universe is just ghosting you? Well, you're not alone. At Love and Lotus Tarot, I keep it real. No crystal balls, no woohoo, just honest, grounded guidance to help you navigate life's chaos. Whether you need clarity on love, career, or just anything that feels like a mess, I've got you. Visit lovelotustarot.com to book a reading, check out some of the new merch, and find the insight you've been searching for. Because let's be honest, therapy is expensive and my cards are way cooler anyways. So head on over to lovelotustarot.com now and let's figure out this thing called life together. Okay, and we're back from the break. I have author Caitlin Rother, who wrote the book Body Parts: A Serial Killer's Deadly Compulsions. She is a best-selling author. I'll have a link for the book in today's description, so make sure you go check it out. And rate and review these books. It helps these books get seen more by authors. Now, this was a re-release with the update in the new book. Is that correct?
Yes, it's 32 pages. It's 10,000 words, and it is by far the biggest date I've ever done on any of my books. So this is an unusually detailed and intensive update.
Okay, well, let's talk about that DNA testing and how it's playing a part in this case. So they identified one of the victims in 2023 using this technology. So how did that work and how did it apply to finding the identity of this woman and how it tied to his case?
So you're familiar with the Golden State Killer in California
Yes.
that made
Mhm.
national news? Well, so basically what the detectives were doing was they were using these consumer genetic genealogy websites, ancestry.com, 23andMe, those kinds of things. But they were doing it kind of on the down low.
Okay.
And they were working with civilian people who were, helping them do some of this work, but they weren't being overtly transparent, like, we're detectives, we're using people's DNA to solve crimes. So things changed after that whole case came to light and what happened. So there's a website called GED Match, which you
Okay.
can sign up for and say, it's okay to use my DNA for law enforcement to solve crimes. So Carrie Ann Cummings, who is this victim who got dismembered and, made the mistake of getting into Wayne Adam Ford's truck. She was hitchhiking, apparently, and she said, I want to go to the beach. Are you going to the beach? And that's where they found her arm, but it's not because that's where he put her parts. That's just where her arm ended up. But ironically,
Okay.
that's where she was trying to go. So
Oh.
he's like, sure, I can go to the beach. So, maybe they did have sex on the beach, because according to her sister, who I also interviewed, she believes, yeah, she probably just had sex with him because, he's probably a decent looking guy. And that's kind of, where she was in her life.
Mhm.
But again, she didn't sign up for everything that came after that. So he panicked, he dismembered her, and he cut her up in his bathtub. And then he took her parts and he put them, including her head, under a cement block on this riverbed at Arcata. That's where he lived in his trailer next to this cement plant. And
Okay.
he left her there. And so the currents basically took her parts and dispersed them, essentially, with the currents took her arm out to the beach, etc. So um, when they found her torso and then they found the arm, they compared the tissue samples and realized it was the same.
Okay.
But those were the only parts they found. He actually, when he turned himself in, he gave them enough information. He said, I want to help identify her. He actually got out of jail, went with them back to where he put the parts to try to help them find her head and find the rest of her. But it was, it had been a year, so that there was no
Okay.
way they were going to find it. So they basically took tissue samples from those parts and they sent them to the FBI. And then, so they were, I don't remember exactly why they did that, but I think that's how they got the DNA profile. The FBI did that for them and sent it back. So they kept it in a freezer, these tissue samples and the DNA profile. So
Okay.
all these years later, after the Golden State Killer case came to, what just came out in the media, Carrie's cousin, Jeff, said, I want to see if I can help identify, because he was already kind of playing around with these websites with his sisters, and they were playing around with genetic genealogy already as kind of a hobby. So he had his DNA profile. He uploaded it to GED Match specifically to see if maybe he could figure out what happened to his cousin. And so the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department, when the new sheriff was elected in 2018, he decided to set up a cold case unit and a website with
Mhm.
all of these missing people, unidentified remains, missing people who were, they didn't know who they were cold cases, solved
Okay.
cold cases. It's like 60 of them, and then another 20 of unidentified remains, including this one. And they decided to look into this one because it was so high profile locally and nationally, that
Okay.
they said, okay, let's upload her DNA into GED Match. And then they found the cousin. So they called the cousin, do you have a missing person in your family? And he said, yes, I do. And is there another relative that's closer to her, like a sister or parent or whatever? He said, yes. And so they gave her the information to get in touch with the sister. Now, here's what I found really important, at least to me personally.
Okay.
They left a message on the sister's voicemail. Her name's Kathy Cummings. And she was very close, and she was the last person who had contact, at least by phone, with her sister Carrie.
Okay.
She basically had this message on her voicemail saying, we're calling from the sheriff's department in Eureka. So she's thinking to herself, well, this really must be about my sister. So she starts Googling, and she finds that she finds the Wayne Adam Ford case, and she finds my
Oh.
book, the original edition,
Okay.
and she reads it 3 times, and she says, that's my sister. So
Oh.
before they even told her that they had identified, through the cousin and the DNA, she had already kind of figured it out, and that was such a
Wow.
relief to her. But she didn't realize that her sister had ever been pregnant, because that's one of the things they could tell from the torso, which I've always found fascinating. I guess there must have been some changes, after you have a baby, but that's
Mhm.
that area of her torso was part of what was left. So they were able to see that. And so she started worrying, what happened to that baby? Is that baby still out there someplace? And I mean, I
Oh
kind
my
of wonder that
god.
too. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, and just to know that reading your book and hearing about how her sister died and that's how she found, oh God, that's gotta be awful. But I
But it was
understand the
closure for her,
relief.
because after
Yeah.
spending so many years just not knowing, it was better just to
Yeah.
know. That's what she
Right,
told me.
right.
And
Yeah.
she didn't seem, she says, "I don't hate Adam Ford, obviously." My sister, so her sister had some mental issues too. So,
Mhm.
what he told the detectives was that, her brain didn't seem quite right. She was, unfocused, kinda like me, kinda like my brain.
Mhm.
It wasn't working right. So she gathered from that, her sister had already had a kind of a breakdown, when she was home a year or 2 earlier before she disappeared, and she went and saw
Okay.
a psychiatrist, and she was diagnosed as being schizophrenic, or possibly schizophrenic. But she was also doing psychedelic drugs, and sometimes psychedelic drugs can cause symptoms that mimic schizophrenia. So it's unclear exactly how bad it was, or whether these symptoms were caused or, exacerbated by the drugs she was taking. And she had a baggie of what Ford thought was heroin in her backpack.
Uh-huh.
So he told the detectives that. And so that's part of why she thought, yes, that was my sister. And she had a tattoo. That was the big thing. She had a
Okay.
special tattoo, with some little roses. And so that's how her sister's like, that was my sister.
Yeah, and it's kind of there are a lot of cases now that are going the way of looking at the genealogy part of it and the DNA testing and making these connections. Now, I mean, like right now, that's the one thing John Ramsey is pushing for, trying to find this DNA evidence and seeing if there's some type of relative that could be associated with the killer. So that way they could put a face to a killer. I mean, sometimes it's not just finding the victims. You can actually come across the
Right.
perpetrator,
Right.
the criminal that caused it. So it's very interesting on how they're using this technology and applying it to a lot of these cold cases. Because,
Right.
I can't imagine living a life, having something traumatic happen to me, and then having that unknown just
Yeah.
linger like a dark cloud over you. And yeah, like you said, her sister was relieved she got closure, but it was just like such a horrific way to find out. But just having that relief of closure for her,
Mhm.
knowing that okay, it's okay to grieve. I know what's going on now. Well, thank you so much, Caitlin, for coming on. This was kind of I like these kind of update things and what technology because like you said, like even back then in 2006, they didn't have a lot of the technology we have today. And it's kind of neat how watching the evolution and the growth of this technology and how it's applying to forensics, even courtroom cases. It's fascinating to me, and I'm glad that you put that update in this book so people can see that, and hopefully, maybe we'll just start pushing for more and more so that way more families can get that closure on cold cases because they have the DNA evidence to connect something. So,
Right.
but yeah, you have the book Body Parts, A Serial Killer's Deadly Compulsions. I'll have a link for that in today's description, along with, now you have a website as well.
Yes, it's
And what
CaitlinRother.com.
Okay, and you've written so many books. I was like going through all your books. I'm like, oh, I want to talk about this one and that one and that one. But yeah, thank you so much. And if you guys have any questions about this type of topic or any type of, if you need some help with some mental illness, I'll put some resources as well in today's description because a lot of times some people are just overwhelmed. And I look back at a lot of these cases and I feel like even like with Jeffrey Dahmer, if they would have got the mental health that they needed back when they needed it, would we not have these
Mhm.
cases today? So that's kind of
Yeah.
interesting, tying that mental illness to it. But thank you so much, Caitlin. Now, the concept of mental illness in relation to true crime has long been debated. While not all individuals with mental health disorders become violent, a disturbing number of serial killers throughout history have exhibited signs of severe psychiatric conditions, many of which went undiagnosed and untreated. Take Jeffrey Dahmer, for example. Dahmer displayed symptoms of psychosis, severe social isolation, and personality disorders, but never received adequate mental health care. Instead of intervention, his behaviors just escalated. Richard Chase, known as the Vampire of Sacramento, suffered from schizophrenia and extreme paranoia. Yet he was released from psychiatric care despite clear warning signs of dangerous behavior. The same can be said for Ed Gein, whose delusions and necrophilic tendencies were the result of untreated psychosis. Now, let's be clear, mental illness alone doesn't create a serial killer. There are many factors that play in childhood trauma, environmental influences, brain chemistry, and in some cases, sadistic or psychopathic tendencies that are not always linked to a diagnosable disorder. However, there is glaring issues in how society treats mental health, particularly at risk individuals. So what are we going to do, and what can we do to make it better? For one, our mental health system is failing. Many individuals showing signs of severe mental distress fall through the cracks due to a lack of resources, stigma, or simply because their symptoms are dismissed. There is also legal barrier. Many people cannot be involuntarily committed unless they pose an imminent threat. Unfortunately, by the time someone is considered a danger, it's often too late. Now, another issue is accessibility. Mental health treatment is expensive and often difficult to obtain. Even when services exist, individuals may not seek help due to the fear of judgment or the belief that their symptoms are not that bad. This is especially true for men who are often conditioned to suppress their emotions rather than address their underlying issues. So, what's the solution? Well, first, early intervention is key. Recognizing the warning signs in children and young adults, such as extreme aggression, lack of empathy, severe isolation, and delusional thinking, can help mental health. Professionals provide support before behaviors escalate. Now, schools, parents, and communities must work together to identify, assist those struggling with their mental health. Now, second, mental health care needs to be more accessible. We need more funding for psychiatric services, community outreach programs, and a crisis intervention so there can be better pathways for people to seek help without fear of being labeled as dangerous or broken. And finally, we need to change the conversation around mental health. The stigma surrounding mental health and illness prevents many people from seeking help until it's too late. We need to normalize therapy, psychiatric care, and open the discussions about mental well being. It's about providing support to those who need it most, because if we ignore the warning signs, we may be allowing the next serial killer to slip through the cracks again. Now, what do you think? Have we as a society failed addressing mental health illness before it turns into something deadly? Let's keep this conversation going. Reach out on social media, share your thoughts, and always stay curious, stay safe, and keep questioning everything. So hit me up at mysteriesmayhemandmerlot.net and make sure you check out my merch store, books, and more. Thank you guys so much, and I hope to see you all next week.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. And until our next case, my armchair detectives, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay aware. I'll see you right here next week on Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot.